Lightning cracked across the night sky as Morgan Freeman stepped into a faded Tennessee diner. The hush was louder than thunder. Suspicious eyes followed him, and the neon sign flickered in warning. Nobody expected him here, but what happened next would truly shake more than just those dusty, time-worn tables. Think Morgan can keep the peace? Type 1 point. Expect trouble? Type 2. Let's hear you. Morgan Freeman pulled into the lot, exhaling slowly as he shut off the engine. It had been a long day. His voice, the one recognized by millions, was tired. He had spent the afternoon recording, meeting people, shaking hands, his mind weary from the weight of conversations and expectations. All he wanted was a quiet meal before heading home. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. Warm air greeted him, laced with the scent of bacon grease and fresh coffee. A faint country tune hummed from an old jukebox in the corner. He smiled. Places like this had a way of feeling like home, no matter where you were. At first, no one reacted. A waitress behind the counter wiped a glass absent-mindedly. A man in a worn-out flannel shirt stirred his coffee, flipping through a newspaper. Then slowly, something shifted. A pause, just barely noticeable, like the brief hesitation before a storm. The waitress's smile faltered. A man at the counter glanced up, eyes narrowing slightly before looking away. A group at the far booth exchanged glances. Morgan had been in enough rooms, enough moments to feel the shift in the air. Something was wrong. He took a slow step forward, placing his hands gently on the counter. "Evening," he said, voice warm, familiar. The waitress hesitated. "Are you dining in?" she asked, her voice careful. And just like that, the night took a turn Morgan never expected. The moment stretched longer than it should have. The kind of pause that wasn't just hesitation, but something deeper. Something unspoken. Morgan had seen it before. That flicker of uncertainty, the unspoken calculation happening behind someone's eyes. A decision being weighed right in front of him in real time. He kept his expression neutral, though his instincts sharpened. "Dining in," he answered, his voice steady, measured. The waitress nodded, but it wasn't the usual automatic nod of hospitality. It was slow, deliberate, like she was buying herself time. "One moment," she said quickly, then turned and disappeared through the swinging door into the kitchen. Morgan stood there, one hand still resting on the counter. A tension crept into the air. A man at the counter, a heavy-set guy in his 50s with grease-stained fingers and a ball cap pulled low, shifted in his seat. He didn't look at Morgan directly, but his posture had changed. Stiffer, less relaxed. Across the room, a woman in a faded denim jacket set her coffee cup down a little too hard, the ceramic clinking loudly against the table. Morgan let out a slow breath through his nose. This wasn't about a table being full. This wasn't about being short-staffed. This was about him. The minutes stretched. Somewhere behind the kitchen door, voices murmured, low, hushed, urgent. He glanced around. The other customers weren't just watching. They were waiting. For what, he wasn't sure yet. The swinging door finally pushed open again. The waitress stepped out, but this time she wasn't alone. A man followed behind her. Broad-shouldered, thick arms crossed over a stained apron. His name tag, slightly crooked, read Hank. Morgan didn't need an introduction to know who he was. The owner. Hank didn't speak at first. He just looked Morgan over, his jaw tightening. Then, in a voice that was gruff but oddly quiet, he said, "I'm sorry, but we can't serve you tonight." The diner went silent. The jukebox hummed a faint melody, but no one was listening to it anymore. Morgan tilted his head slightly. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, calm, but undeniably firm. "I see," he said. "Did I do something wrong?" Hank's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, just for a second. "Nothing personal," Hank muttered, though the way he said it felt anything but. Nothing personal, but not business either. Something else entirely. Morgan let the words hang between them. Let the weight of the silence press down on the room. He had options. He could turn around, walk out the door, and never think about this place again. He could demand an explanation, put them on the spot, ask if they understood how this would look in tomorrow's news cycle. Instead, he simply said, "Then let me speak to the owner." A beat of surprise rippled through the diner. A man near the window snorted softly as if he couldn't believe Morgan was even bothering. Hank exhaled through his nose, rubbing a hand over his face. "You're talking to him," he said. Morgan nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "Then I'll ask you directly. Why?" Hank's jaw clenched. He glanced around, aware that every single set of eyes in the diner was now locked on him. A few seconds passed before he finally answered. "People around here, they got their opinions about you," he said, his voice lower now, more measured. "About what you stand for." Morgan studied him. "And sitting down for a meal is a problem?" Hank didn't answer right away. He scratched at his jaw, exhaled sharply. "Look," he said, "I don't want trouble. I got a business to run." Morgan held his gaze, unwavering. "And me eating here would cause trouble?" Hank's silence was answer enough. From the corner booth, the man near the window, the one who had laughed earlier, leaned back, arms crossed, watching the exchange like it was the best entertainment he'd had all week. Morgan could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about a meal. This wasn't even just about him. This was about perception, prejudice, power. He could leave, walk out, let them have this little victory if that's what they wanted, or he could stay. Morgan inhaled slowly, then he pulled out a chair. The room tensed. He didn't slam it down. He didn't raise his voice. He simply sat. Resting his hands on the table, fingers interlaced, he looked up at Hank. "Then let's talk." The room shifted again. The younger guy in the booth let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "Man's got nerve," he muttered. Morgan ignored him. His focus was on Hank. Hank hesitated, his fingers flexing against the back of a chair. He glanced over his shoulder, toward the counter, where an older man in a worn-out work jacket was watching with quiet intensity. Finally, Hank sighed. "Talk?" he repeated. Morgan nodded once. "You don't want me here, I get that, but I don't get why. So let's talk about it." Hank let out a short breath, shaking his head. "This ain't about you, Freeman." "Then what is it about?" Hank glanced around again, as if searching for backup. Then in a voice barely above a mutter, he said, "People here don't trust famous folks. Don't trust politicians, actors, any of them. They talk a good game, make promises, shake hands, then drive off and forget we exist." Morgan leaned back slightly. "And you think I'm one of them?" Hank didn't answer, but he didn't have to. Morgan exhaled through his nose, nodding. "Fair enough," the younger man in the booth scoffed. "That's all you're gonna say?" Morgan turned toward him, calm. "What else would you like me to say?" The man hesitated. He had expected a fight, an argument. He hadn't expected this. Morgan turned back to Hank. "You said people here don't trust folks like me," he said. "Fine. Then tell me, if I wasn't someone you recognize, just another man walking in here off the road, would we be having this conversation?" The silence was heavy. Hank's fingers curled slightly against the chair. For the first time that night, he looked unsure. From the counter, the old man in the work jacket broke the silence. "Damn shame when a man can't even get a burger," he muttered. A ripple of amusement passed through the room. Even Hank let out a small, reluctant chuckle. Morgan smiled just slightly. "So what now?" he asked. Hank sighed deeply, then finally gestured toward the counter. "Mary," he called. The waitress stiffened. "Get him a menu." A beat of hesitation, then slowly she reached for one. She placed it in front of Morgan without a word. Morgan nodded. "Appreciate it." Hank shook his head, half in amusement, half in disbelief. "I still don't know if I like you." Morgan smirked, flipping open the menu. "That's all right, I don't need everyone to like me." The tension finally broke. Somewhere in the background, the jukebox hummed on. The menu sat on the table between them like a silent truce. The weight of the moment hadn't disappeared, but it had softened, shifted into something else, something closer to curiosity than conflict. Morgan rested his hands on the laminated surface, letting his fingers trace the edges. He could feel Hank's eyes still on him, measuring, waiting. "So," Morgan said, flipping the menu open, "what's good here?" A chuckle, soft, brief, escaped from the counter. The old man in the work jacket, the one who had muttered about the damn shame of a man not getting a burger, gave a slow nod. "Steak and eggs," he said gruffly, lifting his coffee cup to his lips. "Can't go wrong." Morgan tapped the menu thoughtfully. "Steak and eggs," he repeated, looking up at Hank. "Sounds good." Hank didn't move right away. He was still standing there, arms crossed, shoulders set like he was waiting for something, waiting for Morgan to slip up, to show his hand, to prove something Hank already believed to be true. Morgan let out a small breath and leaned forward slightly, his voice lower, quieter, inviting conversation, not confrontation. "Tell me something, Hank," he said. "What did you expect me to do?" Hank blinked. "What? When you told me to leave," Morgan continued, "what did you think was going to happen?" Hank shifted his weight, his fingers drumming lightly against his forearm. "Thought you'd make a scene," he admitted after a beat. "Thought you'd get mad. Start talking about lawyers, your reputation, all that." Morgan nodded slowly, as if considering that. "And if I had?" Hank gave a short, humorless chuckle. "Would have just proved my point." "Which was?" Hank exhaled sharply through his nose. "That guys like you don't get it." Morgan leaned back, letting the words settle between them. "And what is it?" he said finally. "That I don't get?" Silence. Hank didn't answer right away. His gaze flicked toward the front window, toward the parking lot outside. It was dark now, the neon sign reflecting off the glass, casting a faint red glow on the sidewalk. "You want to know what people here think?" Hank said eventually, his voice quieter now, but not weak. Measured, honest. Morgan nodded. "They think you're just another man in a suit," Hank said. "Another guy who talks real pretty but don't stick around long enough to see what happens after the cameras turn off." His jaw tightened slightly, as if debating whether to continue. "They think," he said, "you've already forgotten what it's like to be one of us." Morgan absorbed that. For a long moment he didn't say anything, not because he didn't have words, but because he knew this was the moment that mattered most. Not the rejection, not the stares. This, the part where someone finally tells the truth. "I understand why you feel that way," Morgan said finally, his voice steady but not defensive. Hank gave a wary look. "Do you?" "I do," Morgan said. "And I won't tell you that you're wrong, because you're not. People in my position, actors, politicians, folks with names people recognize. We come through towns like this all the time. We shake hands, we say the right things, and then we leave." He exhaled. "And that's the problem, isn't it?" Hank didn't answer, but his expression shifted, just slightly. Morgan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Let me ask you something," he said. "If I wasn't me, if I was just another man off the road, someone you'd never seen before, would we be having this conversation?" Hank's jaw tightened. "No," he admitted after a beat. "Then maybe," Morgan said, "and that's something worth thinking about." The silence that followed wasn't tense anymore. It was thoughtful. Hank shifted slightly, as if rolling the idea around in his head. Then finally he let out a slow breath and turned toward the counter. "Mary," he called, his voice rough but no longer cold. "Get him his damn steak and eggs." A flicker of surprise passed through the diner. The waitress hesitated, then nodded, grabbing an order pad. Morgan let a small smile pull at the corner of his mouth. "Much appreciated." Hank shook his head, half in disbelief, half in amusement. "Don't thank me yet," he muttered. "Food here's terrible." A low chuckle rippled through the room. It wasn't much, but it was something. The clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversation slowly returned as the diner eased back into itself. People went back to their meals, but the energy in the room had changed. Morgan sat at the counter now, stirring a cup of coffee as the waitress set a plate in front of him. Extra crispy, she said. That's how Hank likes it. Morgan smirked. Then I guess I'll trust the chef. He took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. Not bad, he admitted. Hank, leaning against the back wall, let out a gruff chuckle. Like hell, it's not bad. Morgan swallowed, taking a sip of coffee. Fair point. Across the room, the younger guy, the one who had been the loudest skeptic, was watching him without the smirk this time. There was something different in his eyes now. Not acceptance, not yet, but consideration. And maybe that was enough. The old man at the counter, who had been mostly quiet, set down his coffee and finally spoke up. Ain't often you see someone stick around after being told to leave, and he said, his voice low, worn with time. Morgan looked at him. Ain't often someone gives me a reason to stay. The man nodded as if that answer was good enough. Then he tapped his spoon against the rim of his cup, glanced at Hank, and muttered, Damn shame it took this long for a man to get his dinner. Another ripple of laughter, small but real. Hank shook his head, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Don't make me regret it, Freeman. Morgan smiled, lifting his coffee cup in an unspoken toast. Wouldn't dream of it. And just like that, the night moved forward. People went back to their meals, conversations picked up, the jukebox hummed along. No minds had been miraculously changed. No one had suddenly become best friends. But something had shifted. And in a world where people were always so quick to fight, so quick to leave, maybe staying, listening, meant more than anyone realized. Maybe that was enough. The night stretched on, but inside Ruby's diner, time felt different, slower, like the air itself had thickened with the weight of something unspoken, something neither hostile nor entirely welcoming. Morgan sat at the counter, his plate nearly empty, the remnants of steak and eggs resting beside a half-drunk cup of black coffee. Hank, still leaning against the wall near the kitchen, hadn't moved much since giving the order to serve him. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. But something had changed. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it wasn't rejection anymore either. A man who had once been certain now seemed curious. And curiosity, Morgan had learned, was where real conversations began. So, Hank said finally, breaking the comfortable silence, What's the real reason you stayed? Morgan lifted his cup, took a slow sip. I told you, he said, setting it down. I just wanted a meal. Hank let out a short, gruff chuckle. Bull. Morgan smirked. All right, he admitted, leaning back slightly. Maybe I wanted something else too. Hank raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Morgan exhaled slowly, rubbing his fingers together before answering. I wanted to know if you meant it. Hank's brow furrowed. Meant what? When you told me to leave, Morgan said, meeting his gaze, I wanted to know if you really believed I didn't belong here, or if you just felt like you had to say it. The younger man in the booth, silent for the last few minutes, stirred slightly. The old man at the counter muttered something under his breath, not quite loud enough to catch. Hank let out a slow breath. Does it matter? He asked. Morgan nodded. I think it does. Hank scoffed, shaking his head. Why? Morgan took another sip of coffee, letting the question settle before answering. Because people like to believe they make their own choices, he said, but most of the time we don't. Most of the time we just do what we think we're supposed to. Hank was silent for a long moment. The jukebox in the corner flickered, the hum of an old country song filling the space between them. And what do you think I was supposed to do? Hank finally asked. Morgan tilted his head. I think, he said carefully, someone in this town, maybe a few someones, decided that I didn't belong here. And I think for a second you agreed. Hank's jaw clenched slightly. And now? Morgan shrugged. And now I think you're wondering if that was ever really your decision to begin with. Hank exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. He didn't confirm or deny it. He didn't have to. The waitress Mary stepped forward, collecting Morgan's empty plate. You want a refill? She asked, nodding at his coffee cup. Morgan glanced at Hank. Hank sighed. Might as well, he muttered. Man's been sitting here long enough. Morgan smirked. That sounded dangerously close to hospitality, Hank. A chuckle rippled through the room, soft, barely there, but real. Even the younger man in the booth, the one who had been the most confrontational earlier, was watching now, not with defiance but with something else, something closer to understanding. Mary poured the coffee, and for the first time that night, she didn't hesitate when she set the cup down. "It's strong," she said simply. Morgan nodded. "Good." He took a sip, savoring the moment. Hank exhaled, then finally moved. He pulled out the chair across from Morgan, sat down with a heavy sigh, and leaned his forearms on the table. "All right," he said. "You've been real patient with all this. So tell me, why the hell do you care so much?" Morgan studied him for a moment, then set his cup down. "Because," he said slowly, "I know what it feels like to be told you don't belong somewhere." The words were quiet, but they landed heavy. Hank's eyes flickered, just for a second, with something almost like recognition. "Yeah," Morgan nodded. "Yeah." He glanced around the diner, taking in the faces around him. "And I know that what we do in moments like this, whether we push back, whether we listen, matters more than we think." The room was quiet again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was thoughtful. Hank drummed his fingers against the tabletop, staring down at his hands. "You think you changed anything tonight?" he asked finally. Morgan smiled slightly. "I think I got a meal," he said, "and I think for a little while people actually listened to each other." Hank scoffed. "That's it. That's more than most get," Morgan said simply. Hank let that sink in. Then with a grunt, he pushed back his chair and stood. "Well," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck, "don't expect me to roll out a damn red carpet next time you come through." Morgan chuckled, standing as well. "Wouldn't dream of it." Hank shook his head, half amused, half exasperated. "Mary," he called toward the counter, "put his meal on my tab." Mary raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Morgan smirked. "Careful, Hank." That almost sounded like kindness. Hank pointed a finger at him. "Don't push your luck, Freeman." The diner laughed, a sound that felt warmer than before, more open. Morgan picked up his coat, slinging it over his shoulder. "You take care, Hank," he said. Hank nodded. "You too." Morgan pushed open the door, the bell jingling softly. The cold Tennessee air hit him as he stepped outside. He inhaled deeply, letting the night settle around him. He glanced back through the diner window. The younger man who had challenged him was still watching, but now there was something different in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Maybe understanding, maybe respect, maybe just curiosity. Either way, it was something. Morgan nodded once. The man hesitated, then nodded back. Morgan smiled, then turned toward his car. As he pulled out of the lot, the neon light from Ruby's diner flickered in the rearview mirror. He knew tomorrow nothing would look different. The town wouldn't change overnight, but inside that little diner, inside Hank, Mary, the old man at the counter, and even the skeptical young guy in the booth, something had shifted. And in a world so quick to judge, so quick to divide, that was enough. The hum of the engine was the only sound in the car as Morgan Freeman drove through the quiet streets of Tennessee. The road stretched ahead of him, dark and endless, but his mind was still back at Ruby's diner. He could still hear the faint clatter of plates, the rustle of the newspaper at the counter, the hesitant but genuine laughter that had broken through the tension. He had been in enough places, seen enough faces, to recognize a moment that mattered when it happened. Tonight had been one of those moments. Not because he had won anyone over, not because minds had changed overnight, but because he had stayed. Because, despite the walls built between people, despite the hesitation and the unspoken rules about who belonged where, he had sat down anyway. And so had Hank. And that was something. Morgan had learned long ago that change never arrived in grand gestures or perfect speeches. It came in pauses, the extra second someone took before assuming the worst. It came in hesitations, the flicker of doubt that cracked open the door for something different. It came in small moments, over greasy diner tables, between people who might never have spoken otherwise. That night at Ruby's hadn't been about politics, fame, or even reputation. It had been about being seen, truly seen for who you were, beyond the assumptions, beyond the expectations. Hank had expected a fight. The younger man in the booth had expected arrogance. Even Mary, the waitress, had expected him to leave. Instead, he had stayed. He had listened. And in return, they had listened too. That was the power of dignity, of refusing to let someone else decide your worth. The neon light of Ruby's diner was nothing more than a faint glow in his rearview mirror now, but the weight of the night still sat with him. Somewhere inside, Hank was probably shaking his head, muttering about how he had let a damn actor get under his skin. The old man at the counter was finishing his coffee, maybe thinking that tonight had felt a little different than most nights. And the younger man in the booth, he'd remember. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but someday, when faced with a choice to listen or turn away, he might hesitate just long enough to make a different decision. That was enough. Morgan smiled to himself, turning onto the highway. The road stretched ahead, endless as always. But he knew somewhere out there, in diners and towns, just like this one, other moments were waiting, other conversations, other hesitations, other chances to sit down and listen. And maybe, just maybe, that was how the world really changed. The encounter between Morgan and Hank at Ruby's diner reminds us that the seeds of change often take root in small, everyday moments, like choosing to stay and listen instead of walking away. When a well-known figure sits down quietly, he silently invites those around him to question their assumptions, revealing that even distrust can stem from pain, disappointment, or misunderstanding. Hank's initial hostility turns out to be a protective shell against a world that often overlooks his concerns. And by taking time to genuinely ask why, Morgan frees them both from a cycle of judgment. In a fast-paced life, we rarely pause to see the person behind the facade. Yet empathy and patience are what can soften barriers built by fear. No grand speeches or bold promises, just a willingness to share space and stories. That's the gentle power of genuine human connection, planting seeds for greater understanding. Keep it alive.